report, but want to hear from what folks have to say. But I did want to just call out one area to just have folks ponder on it and see if the commenters might be willing to either comment on it today or come back with some recommendations. With respect to minimum requirements for what constitutes a mandatory restriction on outdoor water use, this is one area that just continues to trouble me. You know, as I travel around the state, I always think of what, you know, would be minimum where I live, and that's very different, you know, when you travel around the state. And so when Eric and I were talking, I just sort of threw out there, you know, the possibility of maybe having climate zones, because I think that if we were to establish a minimum, it's going to have to take into account areas of the state that have warmer climate. And so for folks in Northern California, they're going to hear that minimum and think, oh, this is not too bad. So some way to keep it simple, but to account for the climate as a factor.
And I would add to that, I don't disagree with that, although I do think that if you're in an interior hotter climate, you probably are going to have to do things differently. You're not going to be able to have lots of grass or that sort of thing. But the governor's water action plan calls for conservation as a California way of life. What does that mean? And for me, it's not long-term or short-term. It is how do we implement, how do we and other agencies and other local entities implement this California or conservation as a California way of life? And I think if we can get started now on working on what that means, we can, you know, get to some of these, what you're calling long-term or even medium-term activities. You know, what are we talking about? And that's where I would focus the CEQA work that's going to need to be done. I wouldn't focus on waste and unreasonable use, which is more legal, and you know, I mean, it can be a piece of it, but or public trust, or you know, some of the legal terms that get bantied about, but defining what are putting into place the illustrations of what we think of as conservation as a California way of life is important from my perspective.
Yeah, so you know, in hearing those comments, first on the conservation as a way of life, you know, reflecting now on this presentation, probably temporary and permanent would have been a better choice of words than short-term and long-term. Right. But that's, you know, the permanent
is permanent.
Yeah, it's important. It requires, I think, some additional thought. Board Member D'Adamo, your idea about zones, technically, I think that's doable. I do, you know, I am a little concerned that keeping it simple won't be that simple, and you know, but I understand why you like the idea, and it does make sense. I would just say that that's the type of thing where if you look at, you know, a technical analysis that goes on, usually it probably takes 6 months to a year to get a group of experts in a room to put their stamp of approval and say, you know, this makes sense. You know, it's going to be 2 days in the high desert and 3 days in the Palm Desert, and, you know, doing that type of analysis. So I would just say, if the board decides they want to go in that direction, I think it's important you're willing to live with something that's sort of rough and good enough, recognizing it's short term.
Or another, an alternative might be to really push the envelope on it and then allow local water suppliers to come up with a different approach based on climate and other factors.
I'll put the burden on them for a site-specific kind of exception. Yeah, it's worth thinking about. It's worth thinking about whether we can tune it up without having to quite get there and still make progress. But we'll probably have some comments from our commenters, and it's another thing to be good to talk with our colleagues at DWR on and see how to do it.
And drinking water.
And drinking water. I mean, but the key is to get away from the very light mandatory restrictions. And again, our friends at DWR in reviewing the urban water management plan are making judgments on some basis as to whether they're accurate or not. I have been taking license with it and saying that you could meet the spirit of it if you only watered, you said you could only water wearing blue because it's mandatory, but it's actually a little tougher than that. So. Great. Well, let's hear from folks and then we'll have further conversation. First, we have Kevin Samsam from the Delta Stewardship Council, followed by Dave Boland from Aqua.
Good morning, Chair Marcus, board members.
Good to see you.
On behalf of the Delta Stewardship Council, I just want to commend the success of this regulation had last year on water conservation, and also to plug for some additional data collection. I think that the ultimate goal of the water conservation is to affect the end user, the general public, and while I think the regulations have a tremendous effect, I think the collecting and presenting of the per capita daily use had a big effect as well. Just, you know, you can't manage what you can't manage what you don't have data on, what you don't know. And I think that the media took that reporting and they made it successful. Constant media articles telling everybody what they're doing this month, what the average is. I think that really got people to act. And
I'm told we had 5 million hits our last report. Pretty good.
And I was a couple of those. And I think with that, we should look at, I would suggest that the board look at every opportunity to, maybe there is some additional data collection out there that would have a further impact on water conservation. And I would submit that the point that was brought up by Mr. Oppenheimer, where you collect from water suppliers their data source, or excuse me, their water source. I think that also would contribute to water conservation. I think there's a disconnect for a lot of people, maybe nobody in this room, but there is a disconnect between the water that comes out of the tap and where it comes from. I don't think people understand that. And I think if we could present that to them regularly, that it would have an impact. And you know, there's people out there who probably have groundwater as a major source of supply, and they're not aware of that. But they are aware that groundwater is impacted. There's been plenty of media coverage there, and I think that if we could make that connection for them, or present that data and let the media make that connection for them, that would be an additional motivation for them to conserve. Also, you know, there's actually been studies done that show that people care about their natural resources, and that people, just being good people, are willing to conserve water to spare the environment and the ecosystems from this drought. They realize it's tough on everybody, but they're willing to step up and do more. And if the data shows that, then I think, again, we have an obligation to try and educate the public what the natural resources are that are being impacted by this drought, and how, you know, their conservation efforts are going to help that. So I also want to support all the data collection efforts that could be happening in the future, but I think, you know, Mr. Oppenheimer's right. Keep it simple, keep it focused, don't make it unwieldy. But I think this data set would actually really help achieve the goal that we have, which is water conservation. Also, I think moving beyond that, just collecting this data is actually going to help with water management actions in the future, and even with the board. I know that you guys collect data on your diversion, on your statements of diversion and use. You know, that's collected, I believe, annually. I haven't looked into it in a while, but I think sometimes that data might not be as accurate as we would expect. Collecting any data that duplicates that data on a regular basis, I think gives the board an opportunity to verify data, cross-reference data, check for accuracy, and it goes beyond just the surface water diverters. It actually, this would get at every urban water source. So with that, I just want to say thank you, and Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us. Dave Boland, followed by Tracy Quinn from the Natural Resources Defense Council.
Thank you, Chair Marcus, members of the board. David Boland, Association of California Water Agencies. We provided a comment letter, and we also have another one of our update pieces. I had some handouts and made sure the board had some of those, and we have that posted. That's dated today, and it provides a whole bunch of information about drought response as kind of the focus, and some of the measures that water agencies are continuing to implement, and a lot of numbers about the scale, of water being saved. Appreciated the and we've said before about the value of the monthly reporting in terms of the amount of water that's been saved. And that's very important to get that message out there. In our comment letter, we basically support the idea of extending the emergency regulation. We believe we've got some momentum going, and we want to keep it going. We think it's important in light of the dry year here in 2015 to keep that momentum going. The idea of fine-tuning, we talk about clarifying the mandatory outdoor irrigation restriction. We recognize there's a little ambiguity there that can be, we think, resolved, and we propose a way of doing that in our letter. It, again, is a pretty light touch, just the idea of kind of performance standards that are directed down to the water agencies, and then asking the water agencies to be still responsible about how to implement those outdoor irrigation restrictions. And we recognize the fact, and we've heard from agencies, that there's a big diversity in terms of the climate zones, as was pointed out, as well as just the types of irrigation that occur in a given jurisdiction. And so preserving some flexibility for agencies to provide the number of days a week or the types of time during the day, hours, and so forth. We think that it'd be very difficult to impose a one-size-fits-all here at the State Water Board and make it work. So
can I ask a question? I thought your comments were extremely thoughtful, and I really liked them.
Well, thank you. Yeah, we've actually talked with staff offline about some of them, and there's a lot of, I guess you call it parallel thinking here.
Which is great. But do you mean, and I just wasn't totally clear when you talk about fine-tuning, you mean saying something like you've got to limit the number of days and the hours of the day, but
Yes.
not say which? Because there are some people who may say you can only water 6 days a week.
Right, and part of that, I think you tried to use, and this is, we really appreciate it, first of all, the deference to the local water kind of contingency, shortage contingency planning process, which again represents some diversity out there.
Yeah.
And the idea is the locals needed to make those plans work, and we still want that to happen. We think that's an important tool. But we wanted to, we think that we need to clarify the idea that the mandatory restriction needs to be essentially scalable, and that it's a drought response, and that it needs to be essentially reduced irrigation. And you had signaled 2 days a week. We think that's a reasonably a good benchmark, and the idea is equivalency in terms of your local conditions about reducing your irrigation, so that if you thought you could continue to irrigate 6 days a week, that's not what we're looking for here. And I'm not entirely sure we're willing to work with staff to help maybe craft some language that would provide a clearer direction as to what the Water Board wants to see, which we believe is reduced irrigation statewide to keep plants going, but in light of a drought situation.
Right,
But also
especially
recognizing the fact that that's going to be variable in terms of how it's implemented.
Yeah, appreciate your help there.
Yeah, and then the additional use prohibitions, we suggested a few. There were some of them on the
I
list.
liked a lot of those. I was ready to just take those.
Sorry. Yeah. Well, they're kind of along the lines of the ones that we, that had been proposed before, kind of upping the ante a little bit. There are some that are being used and have been used for years in various parts of the state, like Monterey. We go over there, and they mentioned don't throw or keep your towel up, and we won't launder it again. And the water restrictions at restaurants are very common, and we think that could be done statewide. Again, there's some controversy about whether that's hugely effective, whether we'll have huge amounts of savings statewide, maybe not, but the idea, yeah, exactly, it's an opportunity to send a message. So there are several of those that we offer. And then increasing public awareness, again, Save Our Water is retooling, and there are a lot of ideas there about sending messaging and working with the Water Board on that. And then enhancing the water use reporting by the urban water suppliers. The RGPCD calculation, as you know, has been of some concern. There's a little bit of concerns sort of at a technical level as to how it relates to the other GPCD calculations with the department and then some of the other measures of water use with the council and others. And so we think there's a forum for that. We think we can work together at the staff sort of levels on refining those methodologies, and we would encourage the Water Board's engagement in that process. We also suggest possibly a voluntary reporting of 2007 water use data, not as a benchmark, specifically not for that purpose, but with this idea of daylighting how water use was sort of before the drought, before the recession, at a time that's relatively recent, so it accounts for a lot of conservation that's gotten done, and and sort of a measure by which a lot of agencies are looking at their progress in the last couple of 3 years. So we think 2007 might be a useful year. There's a little controversy about what the right year is. As we know, we talked about that earlier as to whether there needs to be a long period of several years. Again, keeping it simple is a huge message, and really support that message that staff has given about the idea of collecting only data that's actionable and helpful and will frame the issue. But we think this particular data might help with water agencies in terms of showing how they're doing since 2013 to 2015, but also sort of since 2007 and then.
Do you pick 2007 because its relationship to the 20 by 2020 legislation?
Well, not exactly. There's no direct relationship to that. There's a different benchmark, and it's a pretty complex benchmark with the 20 by 2020, and that would be very difficult to drop in wholesale into this process. And we've again, there's been some debate about that as to whether we should try to benchmark based on that. That's for the purposes of benchmarking on targets. The department has got a pretty rigorous process for calculating that. However, the results are that different agencies come up with different benchmarks, so they're not comparable, and that's been part of the effort, or part of the concern with the Water Board's tabular data, is that the press has gotten hold of it, and they wanted to tell a story, and the simplest story is, look at all these people in this column who have high water use per capita and these people who have lower water use per capita. And what we're hopefully, and we think that the caveats that are in the data are helpful in terms of describing the diversity of agencies and the fact that comparing is not necessarily the right thing to do unilaterally. But across the table, looking at progress, that's certainly a proper use of that data. And we thought possibly something else that frames kind of the before drought condition might be helpful. That's something to consider anyway, and we're open and flexible on that point. We have a couple of links about other toolkits that are out there. Mostly that was not obviously to inform your staff as much as it is to kind of inform the greater community about data that is available and helpful tools and water agencies are aware of, and we're helping feed some of that information to our member water agencies. And they can access that through our drought portal. And then a couple of recommendations on longer term. We do believe that there are some processes that we would like to see the Water Board engage in before committing to some longer term efforts. Again, it kind of captures some of the themes that the staff presented in terms of many measures that have been talked about or have been talked about for a long time, and they kind of need some attention by the community, and we think there are some vehicles for doing that. We would encourage the board not to try to use a regulatory vehicle to do that, and that's the main theme there, is that we think there are other ways of accomplishing these longer term shared interests.
Could you expand on that? Because I always find that puzzling.
Well, as we know, regulations are helpful to focus attention and to gain compliance if you're clear on what you want. If you're clear on what specific behaviors you want to incentivize or disincentivize. We think a lot of these longer term measures need some thinking and some work at a policy level to figure out what the benchmarks are, what are we trying to accomplish as a state, I guess. And so we think that work needs to be done before we turn that into any kind of regulatory tool. Now, we're not saying that it can't be done or shouldn't be done down the road, but we think there needs to be a process here. And the specific thing I want to just highlight, which is somewhat controversial, is this idea of resisting the call to state regulation of local water rates. And that's obviously being proposed by some. There's some thinking on the idea that price of water does relate to how folks use water, and it's common in other types of product uses. But we think a lot of work continues to need to be done at a technical level, but also in a sort of recognizing the political context here of rate-making authority at the local level, and the fact that we need to bring an industry along, that there are some models out there, there are some ways of proceeding, but probably an immediate or anytime soon, possibly, any kind of regulatory action on rates would be premature.
I heard a lot of requests for a technical assistance on rates at our workshop.
Yeah,
opposed to
there's a
regulation.
lot of need for funding and a lot of research that folks want to do. They want to hire consultants. They want to build models, and there's a lot of need for all that. Of course, funding it all is going to be a big issue long term, and there are vehicles for that in state agencies that are involved. Again, the department has been involved for a while. The council has been involved for a while on a BMP related to rate. Sending a conservation signal on rates.
Well,
So we
billing
think-
systems are one of the big barriers to putting in budget-based rates. If people have older billing systems, they can't bill once a month. They can't put clever, cute things on their
all the
on their
infographics,
bill.
right. Yeah, and the billing systems are a pretty big financial hurdle for agencies. And then there are a lot of other financial issues related to the billing systems and to rate systems that need to be considered. It's not just about sending a conservation signal. So those are our comments, and we stand ready to continue to work with the staff and look forward to, I think, breaking out the stepwise approach we think is wise, the idea of acting on the emergency order and trying to fine-tune that, as staff is pointing out. We think that that's the first order of business, but we look forward to engaging on the longer term as well.
Well, thank you, and thanks for all the leadership on SaveOurWater.com.
Thank you.
Next, Tracy Quinn from the Natural Resources Defense Council, followed by, drum roll, Tom Martinez from Santa Clara Valley Water District.
Hi, Madam Chair, board members. Thanks for the opportunity to speak today. I presented at the workshop down in Los Angeles, and we followed up with some comments to the board, and hopefully you've had a chance to take a look at them. I just wanted to follow up on those comments with some additional info. We received some feedback. The board received a lot of really great ideas for reporting that data that could be collected. We had submitted 2 ideas, one on requiring the monthly submission of financial data. The state has an interest in the financial solvency of public water suppliers. It'll impact their ability to provide water and to protect public health. We think providing information on the revenue that they have been budgeting at this time and what they've collected year to date would be really helpful in monitoring the financial solvency of those agencies. We also recommended that the board collect information on the number of reported leaks, and we think that that information, having that be publicly available, will put a lot of pressure on water managers. We've seen the success and the effectiveness of the media on the data that has already been collected, and having the information on the smaller leaks that don't typically get media attention, and having that information available could be effective in getting a little bit more attention paid to that matter.
Do you mean, just so that I understand it, do you mean leaks of the system itself or individual leaks?
Distribution system leaks, yeah.
What?
Distribution system leaks.
Distribution, not
Not the
individual
customers.
leak from a house or...
Yeah. So we would be asking the water suppliers already under the council. I think it's BMP 1.2. Water suppliers are required to prepare a database of all of the reported leaks within their system, and so we're just asking them to report that to the board on a monthly basis.
Right, and is that where they get the percentage leak data from?
The percentage leak data, I believe, comes from water audits, which is I think that data goes into looking at evaluating your system, but. We also made some recommendations for improvements to existing policies, and I just wanted to provide a little information on one of them. We had asked that the board require local enforcement of SB 407, which is the retrofit on resale. And I think Eric spoke to it in his presentation. There are two methods we see that we can go about this. One is requiring the water suppliers to have a verification of retrofit replacement on the change of customer, and or having the city have a retrofit replacement. When I gave this presentation, board member Stephen Moore asked if we had examples of cities that had those local ordinances, and we found about 10 so far, and I submitted that in my comments, so you can look to those as examples.
Will you remind me, what was the enforcement mechanism in SB 407?
It just asked that the local, it leaves it up to the local jurisdiction.
And then how would you enforce whether the locals are doing it or not? Would that be an AG thing generally? I mean, absent what we're doing right now, which is unusual for us, what was envisioned?
I think that you would actually require them to have some sort of local enforcement policy. And so that can either be through the water supplier with a change of customer name, having them have a verification that retrofits have taken place, or having it upon resale.
Just so I understand it, so that would be us, what we would be doing is helping to enforce SB 407 by requiring them to, for example, say how they were implementing SB 407. But let's say the drought wasn't happening, and we weren't doing these, we didn't have the authority to do these emergency regulations, or we weren't doing it through a longer non-emergency regulatory process. How did the bill's authors think it was going to be enforced?
I think they believed that the local that the local cities
Would just do
would have some sort of policy, but unfortunately that hasn't happened, and there's no requirement for that to happen under the current
So
legislation.
that's the issue, that we have a state policy
With no
that's
enforcement.
decreed with no.
No enforcement
Okay.
mechanism.
I just want to understand it.
Yeah, and all the full replacements are intended to happen by January 1st, 2017 for single-family homes, and January 1st, 2019 for multifamily and commercial. And so we need to take action now if we're going to be in compliance with that. And despite incentives and rebates that water suppliers have provided, we estimate that there's still 6 million inefficient toilets in California, 10 million inefficient faucets, and 4 million inefficient shower heads, all which could be replaced in the next few years, and could save about 150,000 acre-feet a year of water just from enforcement of this act.
Thank you for the message.
And I know we provided some language to staff for one of our other recommendations on customer leakage. We're planning to do the same for this, to provide you some proposed regulatory language. That's it.
Great,
Thank you so much.
thank you. Mr. Martinez.
Good morning, Chair,
Morning.
board members. Tom Martinez, Santa Clara Valley Water District. On behalf of my CEO and our board of directors, we want to let you know that we appreciate the actions taken to date by the Water Board. The emergency regulations have contributed to the reductions, not only statewide, but for us locally. We have responded to the severity of the drought by developing 15 strategies which fall into 4 categories: water supply and operations, water use reduction, drought response opportunities, and administrative and financial. As a wholesale water agency, it is imperative for our water district to work with our local retailers, cities, and county, and the actions that you have taken have assisted us greatly in that effort. As we are entering our 4th year of a drought, the Santa Clara Valley Water District recommends extending the current regulations as they have shown to be effective. And I want to also take this opportunity to recommend the Water Board use this as an opportunity to further expand and accelerate recycled water, including providing regulatory support and approval and state funding to encourage water utilities that produce recycled water to offer filling stations for residential and CII customers during critical shortages. Pursuing streamlining and permitting an environmental review for recycled water projects. Finally, the expansion of water recycling through potable reuse is critical if California is to effectively respond to future droughts and develop a more resilient water supply. The State Water Board must ensure that adequate resources and funding are dedicated to the timely completion of regulations regarding new uses, such as augmentation of surface water storage. Again, I want to thank you for your time.
Thank you. I assume you'll stay for our next item after lunch. Great. All right. Any questions, further questions or comments for staff? I mean, I think we've given you some supportive feedback. I'm happy to take all of Aqua's recommendations. I'll just speak for myself that I don't know where you think of the hospitality regulations coming in, but again, I think it has really been about messaging, and there are people who just don't, they're really busy lives. They're not thinking about this every day the way we are, and I think people appreciate the reminders. It's not just that I find it galling when the whole set of water glasses end up on the table, even in Sacramento. There's just something wrong with that in the midst of a drought when fields are fallowed and people don't have water to drink at home. So I don't want to go for overkill, but my feedback is think about this, bring something back with the fine-tuning, work with Aqua, our friends at DWR and the other institutions, but just as one member of the board, I'd go for some more of those measures as well.
Ditto, but we definitely do need permanent regulations,
Yeah.
and I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm with you.
We need to work it out. We need to do our normal public process. We need to start. We need to do CEQA. We need to turn every page and make sure we're doing it right. But the state of California and the West is essential that we get permanent regulations, and we do it in collaboration with our colleagues at Drinking Water and DWR and other places. But I just don't see how we can enter the next 30 years with climate change without them.
All right, do you get what you need?
Yeah, I feel pretty comfortable with definitely with the short-term regulation. I think, the minimum restrictions and putting some sideboards on what that means will be the trickiest part, and taking into consideration Board Member Diadamo's request that, we at least evaluate this concept of zones. That's probably the most work. The other things are more fine-tuning. And then in terms of long-term, I just think, obviously we need, or permanent, I should say, we need, to put some more thought into that. We will.
Terrific. Thank you all for that conversation. That was very helpful. Item number 6, we already took, but is there anybody who came here for item number 6 and missed our action on it? Okay, efficient. Thank you. Item number 7, board member reports. I'm speaking to the right this time.
I will just report on one item. I attended the meeting of the San Francisco Bay Regional Water Board last week, and the item that took up the majority of their time was something that we have all received correspondence on, and that is regarding the issue of homeless encampments and the dumping of trash into the water. This was an informational item for the Regional Water Board as they continue to tackle this issue, which is broader than just our water quality concerns. And what they did was ask for presentations by the Contra Costa County Flood Control Water District, City of Oakland, City of San Jose, and Santa Clara Valley Water Districts to make presentation and update the board on what they are doing to comply with the San Francisco Bay Regional Water Board goal of reducing trash by 100% from the municipal stormwater system by 2022. And so these 4 organizations came in and did really excellent presentations of their efforts, which gave me a great deal of appreciation, even greater appreciation of how complex this is and all the societal issues that are involved. Just going out there and picking up the trash doesn't address the bigger, broader issues that will ultimately, achieve the goals that the board was trying to set. So the regional board is still grappling with this issue. It was suggested that staff come back to the board in March or April with some resolution, proposed resolution language with regard to moving forward on just assuring that there is support to the locals in terms of moving forward, recognizing the greater implication of this issue, but providing some reaffirmation and support to the locals in terms of achieving the Regional Water Board's goal for 2022. So I just wanted to update you on that, since we all received some correspondence regarding this matter. But I was very impressed by the efforts that the local agencies are making, and we'll report back to you on what the regional board, what action, if any, the regional board takes in March.
Cuba was fabulous.
Did you look at any water conservation or recycling projects?
I bought this was an arts tour, and I was mostly looking at folk art and modern art, and I bought a piece that had a water theme.
That's way more exciting than mine. Okay, on the 4th and the 5th, I had two meetings with stakeholders in the valley regarding Phase 1. I met with the San Joaquin Tributaries Association, also talked about drought update and the informational order. Ms. Kincaid raised the concerns today. And then on the 11th, I spoke at the Ag Expo in Tulare. This is a big event. For those of you who've never been there, okay, been there. Never seen so many white pickup trucks in one space at a time. Yeah, it's pretty. Yeah, a lot going on in farm country. So I was there to speak on a panel about groundwater. Really good panel. Again, I keep reporting on this, that it just seems that it's less venting and more drilling down, and folks really trying to understand the requirements of the Act. It was a very good dialogue. Unfortunately, what got reported in the paper was not much about groundwater, but about how much water it takes. The hamburger. Have you guys seen the hamburger?
Oh, yeah.
Not an opportunity to get information out beyond those that were at the event. And then on Friday, I sat in on the the first of three water quality stakeholder meetings on fees. And I just want to compliment staff. They did a really good job outlining their way of thinking. I did speak with John Russell earlier today. I think there needs to be probably some input from the stakeholders about how they would like to see things, and actually have them do presentations. This whole comparison to ARB and CDFA, and also to have a spin-off group with not just ARB, but the local air district, which is where those fees go through for the Air Board, CDFA, and our staff, and the stakeholders that say that they would like that comparison, so that there can be a real discussion as opposed to a presentation. And I think that I'm hoping will get us a little bit further along in that discussion. I think that also just wanted to report that the presentation on the performance report was really good, and the stakeholders seem to get a lot more out of that tool as something that they can rely on a little bit more. There will probably be gaps, but it'd be better for them to start with using the tools that we already have, and then trying to add to it.
Terrific. I had a kind of a busy couple of weeks. I won't go through all of it, but I want to thank the team. Darren's sitting here, but also thank John and everybody else who helped with prep for two big hearings that we attended primarily with the Resources Agency to talk about Proposition 1. Last week they were long hearings. I think they were like 3 hours each or longer. And I testified on our behalf talking about Proposition 1 funding. But we had a very engaged set of legislators, both the Water Committee in the Assembly and the Senate Budget Committee. And so that, again, always going to be challenging. There'll be a lot of oversight, which is good, and accountability, but it is a wonderful situation to actually have some resources to help with that whole range of projects on the ground, which stem from the Water Action Plan, which has been reflected in Proposition 1, and a lot of heroes to thank all around for getting that on the ballot and getting it passed, and we're going to be able to help an incredible number of people in the months and years to come. So it's going to be a lot of work, but it's very exciting. So thank you, Darren, and the whole team for really good work in preparing for something which can be a little scary sometimes. So it was really, I felt very supportive. I also did some groundwater work. I spoke with Gordon Burns and with Gary Bardini at the Association of something groundwater agencies. So yeah, National Association of Groundwater Agencies and the National Groundwater Trust. This is largely experts, hydrologists, technical people on groundwater. So very good conversation, and a really very how you do it set of players, people who've done this in the areas in California and other parts of the country where it's very well done. So it was a really cool set of people to be around. And one of the interesting questions I did get was on efforts to help, and I know we're working on that, and that Eric is working on that with DWR and how to help people with facilitation assistance, because even these very highly technical people realize that the facilitation necessary to make the governance part of it work is a really, really big deal. So I'm glad we're working on that, and would love an update on that sometime soon. I also finally I went to the mountain and I saw Orange County Water District and got the full-on tour, like sort of state-of-the-art. I didn't drink it because we sat in a room with a bunch of maps and we didn't walk out there, unfortunately, so I have to go back. But that was really, really very good. I also spent some time on conservation and recycling. I went and I covered the Region 9 board meeting in the beginning. I hadn't been to one of their board meetings because you were out of town, and stayed for a big chunk of a presentation they did, which is similar, on the state of recycled water. It had a number of the people who will probably be testifying, looking at the PowerPoint. I've already seen much of the PowerPoints we're going to be seeing in our next item, but it was just nice to be there and see the enthusiasm that folks had for it. And I also went to and spoke with Cynthia Gomez and Anacita Augustinez at the California Nations Indian Gaming Association conference on water conservation, which is a very big deal in tribal casinos, which was fascinating, and they wanted to know what's the state of play and what's the state of the art. Met with a number of tribal leaders, and also just heard some amazing stories about water reclamation happening, where you do have tribes who are putting in casinos, which are giving them, that's a lot of toilets, right? They can put in low-flow toilets, but a number of them are putting in dual plumbing and then have recycling facilities, and they're using the recycled water to flush toilets. I mean, it was definitely award-worthy stuff that we should be nominating people for, but a way of looking at a scarce resource, even as you're trying to develop resources for the tribe, that sounded pretty state-of-the-art to me. So it was kind of cool, I have to say. That was inspiring. So I'll stop there. It was kind of a busy 2 weeks, but it was exciting. Well, with nothing else there, Mr. Howard, Executive Director's Report. You've had a busy couple weeks, too. Anything that you wanted to flag in this, you and the staff? It feels like it gets thicker all the time. I know sometimes we're asking you for more things, but
yeah, well, a lot of
amazing.
it's attachments that we try to keep up with anyway, because it helps us in just managing all these projects we have going. I just mentioned one thing that didn't make it into the report. I'm not sure why. On February 11th, the water rights staff was up at Chester in Plumas County to talk about Lake Almanor and the 401 cert for that project. The issue in that area is temperature in the North Fork Feather River, and what operation of Lake Almanor would be best for dealing with the temperature issues that have been identified there. But of course, the main concern folks have is the proposal that there be a thermal curtain considered, and the aesthetic and possible effects that would have, and the effects on the cold water pool in Lake Almanor itself.
Within the lake, right.
Right. It is a, you know, a well-known fishery, and the cold water pool is what's necessary to support that fishery. So in any event, the recommendation from staff at this point is, or that's still being considered, but the preliminary recommendation, which I asked them, staff to put together because I wanted folks to have some focus to their comments to us, is that we don't, in the first instance, require the thermal curtain, that instead we increase releases at another section of the area into Canyon Creek and see whether or not that has adequate temperature control effects. And if it does, then we'd never move to the thermal curtain, but to leave a reopener in case that seems to be something that is necessary in the future as we continue to evaluate the effect of the operations that we're proposing in the first instance. So right now we've still got to finish the CEQA document, do the response to comments. Just for clarification, in the first instance, usually I'm the one who signs the 401 certifications. The water board then deals with them in the petition for reconsideration that seems to occur for every one of these because they're controversial. And that'll probably be, my signature will probably be sometime near the end of the year.
What kind of reaction did staff get to the proposal? I read the article in the clips, and I didn't quite understand it. I mean, I got sort of the angry comments from a variety of the commenters, but I couldn't discern, maybe if I reread it I would, discern what their reaction to that proposal was. I was a little confused.
Well, I think
reading the
most
story.
people are mostly confused about it. If you read the articles on it and other things, you get this, and comment letters we're getting, you get the sense that the thermal curtain is a foregone conclusion, when in fact it's, you know, basically it's a reopener that says, you know, if other things aren't working, we can reopen and put in, you know, we're leaving that option open. And if we did do that, we would require a whole new, you know, comment period and amendment to the order, and so it's not as if it just happens automatically. It becomes, you know, again, a decision that has to be made and that would presumably be available for reconsideration by the board. So, you know, it's, I think, like I say, the main concern people have is sort of the idea that this is a done deal and that, but really they don't want the board to consider the thermal curtain as an option at all, even as a potential reopener in the future.
I've seen the stop the thermal curtain signs driving us in.
And that was all I wanted to cover. Thank you.
Any other questions on this one? Thank you, as always. It's really totally impressive. All right, the next item won't be heard before 1. Can you post, I think I need a little bit longer of a lunch break. How are you guys with coming back at 1:15, sort of splitting the difference? Okay, 1:15, because I know we have some folks here for it already. I don't want to keep them too long, but I need a little more time. Thank you.
that's where me and Noah never heard anything until the notice came out. So we were kind of like, Debbie drove it, and I didn't want to